Today I am visiting with Michelle M. Wu, who recently retired as Associate Dean for Library Services and Professor of Law at Georgetown University Law School. First, let me mention that we are doing this session virtually due to the restrictions on travel because of the coronavirus pandemic currently. This is August of 2020, uh, literally affecting everyone in the world. Michelle, it is our custom to begin these conversations, or as I like to call the interviews, with a little personal information. Could you tell us about yourself, perhaps not only now, but perhaps when you were younger?
I was born in Rochester, Michigan, a suburb of Detroit. My father was a tenured mathematics professor at Oakland University, and my mom worked for various organizations while we were there, but longest for General Motors. My parents had two children, me and my sister, who's 2 years older. My great aunt also lived with us. Like in many small towns, we never locked our doors. We walked or biked everywhere, and probably spent more time running wild and on our own outside than we did indoors or under adult supervision. It was an interesting environment because despite the paucity of minorities in Michigan overall, I think even aggregated we made up less than 1% of the population. And Rochester being a fairly small city, it was a university neighborhood. So there were more minorities there than in nearby neighborhoods. That doesn't mean a lot of diversity, but it does mean that I wasn't the only minority in my class. I didn't know it then, but found out later that as we were growing up, my parents sensed that the region was getting a little more dangerous for minorities, particularly Asians. White supremacists were running for office. There was increasing violence against Asians because Japanese car companies were thought to be taking work away from American car manufacturers. Remember, we were in a suburb of Detroit, so that fear was highly relevant. Vincent Chin, for example, was murdered about 20 miles away from us when I was 12. My dad went back to school, got a degree in engineering, and got a job in California as an aerospace engineer. So when I was 13, we all moved to Central California, which is in Southern California and about 15 minutes away from Disneyland, which is a landmark that most people are familiar with. It was a completely different world. It was much more populous than where we had lived, but the culture was unfamiliar. We did have to lock our doors. The neighborhoods were very diverse, and you really couldn't get anywhere without a car. I went from having maybe 60 people in my entire grade to having 500, to having one Chinese girl in my grade to having about 10 Asians in each course, and all of them from different countries. I hadn't realized what I was missing until I had it, but I will never again take for granted the comfort and meaningfulness of connecting with people who immediately understood my family's habits and cultures, and to be exposed to a wide diversity of opinions and to have that wide range be considered acceptable. Since then, I've lived in 5 other states, but have always found myself drawn more to big and diverse cities than smaller or non-diverse ones. I currently live in Alexandria, Virginia, which is just a few miles south of DC.
Well, it sounds like you've been around a bit. Michigan, I can understand the car thing. I have a daughter who lives there, married a local boy, shall we say, some years ago, and they still only buy American cars.
So it's considered a loyalty issue as much as anything else. So it's very, very hard to break out of that mold if you're living right there next to the car manufacturer.
I suppose you're right. Could I ask you if you have any hobbies or any other special interests that perhaps you pass time with?
The consistent hobbies are reading, writing, and traveling, but I'd say that the persistent passion is for learning new things. And that's why my hobbies change rapidly over time. I can be obsessed with something like knitting for a year, and then I'll drop that to learn a new skill. Currently, I'm teaching myself Swift, which is an iOS programming language, and how to use Blender, which is an animation software package, as well as volunteering at a food bank and making masks for nearby communities.
Sounds like you can keep busy and don't get bored, because if you decide about something is getting a little monotonous, you just find something else.
That's right, absolutely.
Well, among other things, you've already alluded to your background academically, but specifically, can I ask you, I understand you have 3 degrees. Can you tell me what they are and where you got each?
Yes, I have a degree in psychology from the University of California at San Diego, awarded in 1991. I also have a law degree from California Western School of Law from 1994, and a master's degree in librarianship with a certificate in law librarianship from the University of Washington in 1995.
Well, I noticed in looking up your background that after you got your law degree, you sort of moseyed up north here on the West Coast, where I am, to Seattle specifically, and studied under Penny Hazelton at the University of Washington in the law librarianship program. Can you tell me perhaps what motivated you to do that, and more specifically, did anyone play a role in helping to recruit you into law librarianship?
So I have to admit, I didn't even know that law librarianship was a career when I went to law school. If I did, maybe I would have taken a different path, still towards law librarianship, but maybe in a different order. But in any case, when I was in law school, I realized within the first year that I was unlikely to practice law. I'd gone to law school more because I lacked direction than because I wanted to practice. And while I found that I loved the complexity of legal theory and argument, I didn't particularly care for the adversarial nature of law and the areas that interested me most, like juvenile justice. Well, I just didn't really think that law was the best solution in those cases. So at the same time, I was working at the San Diego County Law Library as a shelver. Mm-hmm. And I was fascinated by the reference transactions that I saw there. The reference librarian seemed to know everything, was equally helpful to lawyers and pro bono litigants, and I could see how much of an impact that he had on the people that he helped. My supervisor at the time was aware of Penny's program and suggested that I look into it. And ultimately, that's how I ended up at the University of Law.
Well, that's interesting. We all have our stories, and I've heard many of them now in these various sessions over the last few years, how one gets into it. Yours is not unique, but it's special. Speaking of being special, is there anything that you can remember about your time at the University of Washington, Penny, you want to mention at this point?
It's not so much a specific memory as the overall feeling of being under the guidance of someone who knew the profession inside and out, who could help us get jobs in what was then a fairly challenging job market, and who focused as much on soft skills as she did technical skills. One of the best parts about Penny's program is that it paired work with classes. We were expected to work in the library, and not just in one department, but in, I won't say all the departments, but many of the departments. And as it turns out, that type of exposure is how I learned best. So it was a great environment.
I think that's one of the special characteristics of that program, at least going back even to the years when I was a student in there, is the practical experience you got on top of the academic aspects of it. And that was very special. Yeah. Well, you graduated from library school, and your first position after that was as a government documents reference librarian at the George Washington Law Library in Washington, D.C., where you are now. Can you tell us a little bit about your roles there and some of what you did? You were there for about 6 years, as my notes indicate, in total.
GW was the perfect first job for someone like me. I began there while the library was in its own transition stage, so they were hiring 5 librarians at the time they hired me. I got to start with a cohort, which just makes starting a new job less daunting. And the law school itself was starting to kick into technological high gear. In addition to the usual library responsibilities, we were also responsible for training faculty in moving from DOS to Windows. Scott Pagel, the director there, both then and now, encouraged the development of GW's librarians in a way that allowed me to try my hand at just about everything in the first few years that I was there, from cataloging to serials, the ILS system, reference, loosely filing, rare books, teaching, and publishing. Name it, and if I had an interest, I was free to explore it. For someone whose core motivation is learning, there was no better place to be. In the years at GW, I had a new position or title nearly every year. As you know, I began as a government document / reference librarian. A little over a year later, I became the computer services librarian, and that's when I began to supervise employees. I supervised 1 full-time staff member and a series of students. Then I became the head of public services, then the assistant director for public services, and finally the assistant director for information services. The most important thing, or the most important lesson I learned there were more soft skills I'm not entirely sure that's the right way to describe it, but it was really the nature of work and politics. I learned how to question gossip, something that I clearly had not known how to do when I started. I trusted everyone and believed everything. I began to understand that there's a lot to management that can't be taught in class, and that doing it right is tremendously difficult, not the least because you can't always tell your employees everything. And because Scott gave us the freedom to do so much, I gained a deep appreciation of the complexity of every library job and its interactions with every other library job.
Well, Scott has been there a long time. This is Scott Pagel, of course. And I think he came one of my relatively early years in D.C., and that was about 30 some years ago. So he's been there quite a while. And
he has.
Yeah,
and he loves the library so much.
Yeah, he was a good friend too for all of us. A good colleague. Yeah. Speaking of colleagues, often as we sort of get into our field, sometimes even later, one counts one or more persons as a mentor, a special mentor. And I'm assuming Penny would probably qualify, Penny Hazelton, but is there anybody else?
I'm right that both Penny and Scott were my primary mentors. Penny because she introduced me to librarianship and was always willing to lend an ear or a hand to any of her students or former students. Scott because of all the reasons I detailed above. But I'd also name Nancy Rappaport as a mentor, probably in a less traditional way. From her, I learned from observation even more than direct contact. And she was dean at the University of Houston when I was there. And she served as a meaningful example on how to meet with grace the pressure and challenges that women in power in particular face.
I imagine that would be very useful skills in today's world, since more and more women are, as far as I see it, aspiring and moving into positions of real power and authority, which is good. Yeah.
It's fantastic. Although I will say, before I started taking positions that were outside of the library, or I shouldn't say necessarily outside, but the director level or higher, I don't think I realized the types of challenges that you encounter as you move up. And I did feel greater resistance as I moved up in the ranks.
Well, you've already alluded to your next job after you left GW. You went down to the University of Houston and had a very unusual kind of situation there about the time you arrived. You'd had a tropical storm go through that got into the underground utility systems in a bad way on the campus. And the low points, which included the law library's lower level, there are two underground levels there, and a parking garage under the hotel on the other side of campus, all got flooded big time. Would you like to talk a little bit about your years at Houston, and more specifically perhaps some of these unique challenges that you and the others there faced?
Sure, it's hard to even know where to begin because of how intense those years were. First, yes, you're correct in noting that Tropical Storm Allison essentially destroyed the library's collections. What damage 8 to 12 feet of water didn't do, Gould did, as the water had to sit for some days before people could get into the building. I had accepted the job as associate director, knowing that I would be helping in recovery, but hadn't realized what an enormous job it would be. When I arrived, it wasn't just about rebuilding the library's collection and running the usual library operations. It was also taking on renovation of library spaces that had been damaged, setting up an off-site location, filling 5 vacant positions, and dealing with a lot of ongoing political issues at the school. And then, to my surprise, within 6 months, the director, who was John Schultz, retired, and I became acting director. In terms of unique challenges during this period, they are pretty much endless. From trying to renovate a library when there was still a risk with every rainstorm that water would enter the facility. I mean, I remember as rain would be coming down, I would be running around the library pulling out plugs because I didn't want anyone to be electrocuted, and water was actually still coming into the library. So I mean, that was definitely unique. Or trying to accommodate not only our students, but also those that were temporarily with us from New Orleans because of Hurricane Katrina, which happened, I think, my second year when I was there. To working in a community where overt discrimination was still apparent, even if only in small pockets. It was, after all, at UH that I got my first death threat for being a girl telling a man what to do. And please don't get me wrong, the majority of people that I met in Houston were as thoughtful and as kind as I've met anywhere. but the range of acceptable behavior was wider there than I had seen at GW, and included behaviors that I think would not be as acceptable today.
Well, speaking of Houston, you left there in about 2004 and moved to Hofstra as director of the law library and professor of law. Um, Later, you, in addition to your so-called full-time day job, you became interim senior vice dean for academic affairs for the 2007-2008 academic year. Do you want to talk a little bit about your adventures, I think is the right word now, for Hofstra?
Looking back, I will forever be grateful for the opportunities that Hofstra gave me. As appreciative as I was for the experience and education that UH gave me, each day was very much a battle, whether with the elements, the enormity of the job, or the difficulty of tackling the job as a young woman and an acting director without tenure. Hofstra instead was the first school where I felt instant acceptance. Maybe because I was hired into a tenure-track job instead of trying to do the job without tenure. Maybe it was because the school was ready for a change and was completely on board with the ideas that I had. For whatever reason, I felt their support from day one, across all constituencies, both within the library and without. I was granted tenure 2 years after I arrived, and I wasn't the one who asked for an earlier tenure review. The faculty raised the idea themselves and then voted unanimously to grant me tenure and promotion. Even today, the generosity of that gesture humbles me. I don't know how many schools, whether then or now, that would take such care and pay so much attention to the efforts of a junior faculty member who wasn't pushing for advancement herself. In 2007, our then dean was unexpectedly admitted to the hospital and had to go through emergency quadruple bypass surgery. Shortly thereafter, we were told that he wasn't returning. Our then vice dean became interim dean, and I was asked to serve interim senior vice dean. I turned down the position twice, but when the president asked the third time, I realized that this wasn't really an ask. This was something the university needed me to do, so I said yes. Fortunately, I will say I didn't have to carry the library responsibilities concurrently. We did appoint an interim acting director of the library, who was Lisa Spar at the time, so that I could focus completely on running the law school. It was a crazy year and a half, but at the same time a pretty enjoyable one. Our interim dean was the first female dean at Hofstra, and the dean's office was, for the first time, all female. I had one of the more challenging jobs, as the other vice dean reported to me, and a lot of the emotional appeals, such as appeals for lost scholarships, academic dismissals, they fell to my responsibility. But the dean's office worked incredibly well as a team, and that made all of the challenges that we encountered doable. I found and trained my successor, and then returned to the library, though in doing so, I kept some of the vice dean responsibilities, such as supervision of the IT department, and that's when my title changed to Associate Dean for Information Services.
But it sounds like you're here as vice dean. Must have been a while, because that's the job that we used to refer to as herding cats with the faculty. Getting them to do what they needed to do, but might have been somewhat reluctant to agree to.
This is where I think it helped me, in that apparently the reason why the president asked me to take the job was because the faculty had suggested me. And the faculty knew I didn't want the job. So actually they had all the reason in the world to cooperate with me in that position. So I think that they were much more accommodating to the questions or the asks that I had for them during that year, because they were aware that this was not something that I wanted and that I was doing for the school. So that made the entire process, I think, easier for me than had I been a permanent academic vice dean.
I imagine there were colleagues on the faculty, as there are almost probably every place, who would aspire to become a vice dean and then a dean. But as you say, you were not, that was not your goal. That's probably exactly why they recommended you for the job, because it was not going to turn it into a political, I'm trying to get the top job next.
Although they did try to talk me into taking it permanently, but there was no way that I was going to take that job permanently.
In 2010, you accepted appointment at Georgetown as director of the law library, and later to be retitled Associate Dean for Library Services. You were also a professor of law. Your predecessor, in fact, was the legendary, I call him that, Bob Oakley. I think he'd kick me if he heard me do that. Uh, and he had unexpectedly died because he had picked up a MRSA infection after otherwise minor surgery. Um, so you were a successor, and that's one of the premier libraries in this country these days. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your activities and accomplishments in that role?
First, I should say that very little of what I've accomplished, whether at Georgetown or any of my previous institutions, is my accomplishment alone. Libraries are, by their very nature, team efforts, and without the teams at each library, I would not have been able to do nearly as much. At Georgetown, I will say the team there was and is incredibly talented, and Bob had already established Georgetown as a leader in the field. Both of those components of the job gave me a huge leg up in terms of what I was able to do. So while at Georgetown, I did a number of things, but I think those that might be called hallmarks are implementing a faculty liaison program, creating a digital initiatives department, reintegrating our libraries, and deepening Georgetown's reputation as a library that trained future library leaders. The faculty liaison program wasn't entirely new. Georgetown had a stripped down version of it available to about 20 to 25% of the faculty when I arrived. But that seemed a little unfair to the faculty overall, as was reflected in the meetings I had with them shortly after I arrived. So the faculty liaison program established was intended to offer all of our research services to all of our full-time faculty. We actually ended up extending those services even further to our administrative offices, though we didn't do that officially through the liaison program. Our digital initiatives department was created both to fulfill the law school's mission of public service and also to carry forward Georgetown Law Library's reputation for innovation. We digitize materials like older legal dictionaries, circuit court briefs, SEC documents, all for public access. But we have also undertaken novel projects like creating databases for our faculty research or implementing a pilot of controlled digital lending called CDL for short. CDL was a legal theory I developed at the University of Houston, though I didn't call it CDL at the time, and which I had tried to convince several organizations and schools to adopt in the years since. But the first green light I received was at Georgetown. The third accomplishment was the reintegration of the Georgetown Law Libraries, and that largely was a necessity because of the growth of the law school and the lack of the space on campus. I think many other law schools and libraries have seen the same phenomenon. In our case, we had two separate physical libraries, and since Bob had opposed the separation of them at the start into those two libraries, it wasn't a huge stretch to see the promise and opportunities in reintegrating those libraries, so we did accomplish that. And probably the most meaningful long-term, may be that we made many efforts over the years to contribute to the education of future library leaders. Within the Georgetown Library, we had various cross-training programs and tracks to promote the professional development of our librarians and our staff. I set for the first time a professional development fund for each librarian, and I actively encouraged the use of webinars and local conference offerings to educate all of our staff. I also participated in and ran leadership training programs for both current and prospective law library directors. And in the 10 years I was at Georgetown, 10 of our librarians became directors or acting/interim directors of libraries. In addition to the library, I assumed responsibilities at Georgetown over the years, including serving as acting associate dean for administration and finance, acting head of human resources, or I oversaw space planning across campus and training incoming associate deans. I also created and co-taught an annual national leadership course for law school associates.
It sounds like your years at Georgetown, you were there, about 10 years, I guess, now that you have recently retired from that job. One of the things that a characteristic of that job was you followed one of the luminaries in our field, Bob Oakley. Bob had died quite tragically. He had gone in for surgery and got a MRSA infection that they couldn't stop. We also had about the same time this profession lost another luminary, perhaps a little more controversial in some circles, but Roy Mursky. And I want to acknowledge that you and Dick Spinelli from the Hine Company were the masterminds, as I understand it, behind this project to try and capture some of our oral histories in this project. Can you talk a little more or expand a little bit about how all that came about and so on?
When Bob and Roy, legends in librarianship as you've noted, passed away so suddenly, I was struck by how much the profession had lost and thought of all the others in their cohort and nearing retirement. While we had lost the chance to capture Bob and Roy's wisdom, we still had a chance to reach others. So Dick and I happened to be at a conference together at the time, so I mentioned it to him and suggested that Hine might be interested in undertaking this type of project. And the next thing I knew, Dick had gotten approval and had gotten the project in motion. Though this was my idea, full credit goes to Dick, you, and Frank Hudek for making it a reality, as all of you, especially you, Pat, have been the ones to invest the most time in production. It has been such a pleasure with working with all of you. And I'm delighted to be even a part of it, even though, again, I think all of you have done much more work on this than I have. I mean, you've provided the technical expertise, obviously the human resources in terms of traveling to and talking with all these people. This could not have been possible without you.
Yeah. Of course, today, as I have alluded already, I think once, we're doing this session in a whole new technical way, which is by way of Zoom. And you know, hopefully it'll all come out beautifully, but I'm not betting the store on that quite yet until I see the result that we're recording. You have had the title professor of law. Have you actually taught any courses as such?
So I've taught in all of the schools except Houston. I think at GW I co-taught advanced legal research with Scott Fagel. At Hofstra I taught copyright licensing, and at Georgetown I taught both copyright licensing and the core copyright course. In all cases though, I didn't teach often. My administrative duties, especially when I started wearing multiple hats at different schools, they just became too time consuming. And so teaching took a back seat to other skills that were, I think, harder to find within law school administration, whereas they could find it in me.
Well, you certainly, even though you've had your plate full with jobs and projects and so on, you've still taken a lot of time to engage in professional writing and scholarship. And much of that is very highly regarded, as you well know. Could I ask you to perhaps talk a little bit about some of that and maybe even mention why it is you feel it's so important that you actually do it, even though you have more than one day job from time to time at the same time?
So it's funny in some ways how much I wrote, especially at the start of my career, because it wasn't required either at GW or Houston. My job did not contemplate or did not require writing at all. At first, I think I wrote because Penny had told us this was something we should do, and we follow Penny's advice, so I wrote because Penny told us we should. And I also was part of a cohort of new librarians at GW, which made it easy to find a co-author. But then I realized that I enjoy writing, and as I advanced in my career, I realized I did have things to say that I hoped would benefit other people in the profession. My later scholarship did split into two directions. The first was in library administration, developing and editing books where respected directors would provide insights into management strategy and leadership. With the wave of retirements that we've seen over the last 10, 15 years, and the shrinking of libraries, there are simply more people stepping into leadership positions without having been in an assistant or an associate directorship. So these books were a way to share some expertise for future leaders who wanted to hear from a truly talented cohort of library directors. The other track for my scholarship was a focus on where I thought libraries should go, whether it was about controlled digital lending, partnering with other industries to make a better ILS, or the importance of shared collections. That's the scholarship that has been most meaningful to me, and also has probably had the widest impact, read not only by those in the U.S., but countries all over the world, both within librarianship and without. The reason why I think that it's important to write is, I think, partly to memorialize what librarians do. Right now, that's the historical aspect, that's the preservation aspect, but also just to share our knowledge. Like I said, there is a teaching component to writing, where you might be speaking to the generation coming up after you, where they can learn from both the things that you've done well as well as the mistakes that you've made, and you don't have to repeat them again. So there is tremendous power in scholarship, and I do encourage anyone who has any interest or thinks that they have learned from the lessons or their experience that they should impart that to others through some scholarship.
Well, you have had not just a stellar career in terms of jobs and professional writing and scholarship, but you are this summer's recipient, one of them, of the Marian, Gould, Gallagher Distinguished Service Award, which is ALL's highest award, basically to recognize major contributions in terms of leadership and service to the association and to our profession. So congratulations to you on that. But also, could I ask you to perhaps talk and describe some of the things you did over the years? I know you were a vice president of the Law Librarian Society of Washington, D.C. at one point. And you've had other roles. With that, by way of introduction, I'll let you take it from here, Michelle.
Sure. So as the publication where I would write on anything when I started, I just wanted to learn as much about the profession as I could, and service was one way to do that. So I participated at the local level. So I was the vice president, as you mentioned, the LSDC. I participated on the national level as well in terms of being the chair of the academic SIS. I also chaired AALS's section on library and information services. So I tried, and I also did a lot of work with Crib, which was fantastic in AA. I tried to do a little bit, again, of everything, just to learn more about how, I won't say the mechanics, but how a lot of the politics of librarianship works. And I would encourage anyone who hasn't volunteered for service yet to do so. Not only can it give someone a better understanding of the profession and introduce them to sectors of law librarianship that they might not encounter often, such as private law librarianship or government law librarianship, but it can also help you build essentially a network such that you will have built-in partners whenever you take on projects in the future. And indeed, that's what happened with me, is I built friendships through service, as well as just networks that allowed me to find future authors, for example, for any book that I was editing on leadership. I believe very strongly that all of us have an obligation to the profession, to our peers, and to those coming up after us. How we decide to meet that obligation is a very personal decision. You can do it through publication, public speaking, committee service. But of all those three, service is the one that gives you the closest contact with the diversity of opinions.
Well, we've been focusing sort of on your past, which obviously is considerable, but earlier this summer, just a few weeks ago now, you retired from your last job at Georgetown, but you're not through. At least you don't look to me like someone in my age bracket who really ought to retire, probably. So you do have plans. Can I ask you to share a little bit about some of what you're planning to do in the future?
I think you have more energy than all of us, Pat, so like you're never going to really retire.
Looks are deceiving.
I'm not retired in that I'm planning to kick back and do nothing. But I did retire simply because I was ready to leave both librarianship and Georgetown. As I mentioned, I'm learning some new programming languages and software packages. That's largely in service to my retirement goal. I've been increasingly troubled by growing inequality in the world, and I'm working on several projects that aim to try to chip away at the systems that encourage that gap growth, especially looking at wealth inequality. Most of my ideas involve the use of technology, for example, making it easier for those in gig economies to work without paying overhead to an app provider, or building platforms to connect people who need resources with those who have them. So that's what I'm going to be doing in various iterations, I think, in retirement. I am fully aware that because a lot of this is new or innovative, that there's a high chance of failure, but I'm okay with that. I would rather try and fail than not try, and I think I'm just at a place in my life where I feel I have to try.
Well, I suspect that attitude has been prevalent throughout your career and probably why you've never failed and won't. At least that's my hope and my thoughts.
Everyone has to. To learn, you have to fail. But I'm okay with that.
Well, Michelle, sort of on that basis, we're probably nearing the end of our conversation today. But before we do, I'd like to give everyone in your role an opportunity to have the last word if there's anything we have not talked about that you would like to bring up. And not everybody does, so it's not a test.
You've been very thorough, so I don't think I have anything to add.
Thank you. I've had some good help from the others on this project on what to do about these sorts of things. Hopefully, and I've enjoyed it, as I've told you, as you I think have as well, being part of the project. So with that said, Michelle Wu, I want to thank you for taking time today to speak with me, even if we're doing it from the other side of the country, each one of us from the other. And in thanking you, I'm thanking you as always, not only on behalf of somebody named Michelle Wu, but also Frank Hodak and Dick Spinelli, our colleagues with whom I have had the pleasure of working to put together this oral history of law librarianship for the Spinelli's Law Library Reference Shelf portion of Hein Online. Thank you again.